Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked here on the channel. This is the series where we talk about every single book on my shelves because I have to conceal my identity. Today we are talking about Ann Leckie's Imperial Radch trilogy. Radch. Hard to say. I was about to do a big speech about how my copy of the book was missing somewhere, but it was literally behind me. Here it is. There we go. This is a science fiction series from author Ann Leckie. It released from, let me check my notes, October of 2013 to the most recent book, which came out in June of 2023. So we've been a full decade in the mix. Ann Leckie is another one of those authors who you hear a lot about in this space. The other book of hers that I've read is called The Raven Tower, and it's wonderfully weird. I think she does a lot of really interesting stuff to do with perspective and narrators in books. Yes to that. She's a Hugo Award winner and in my opinion, rightly so. This series is something of a space opera, though I realise, saying that out loud, I don't exactly know how people define what a space opera is, but this apparently is one, where we are quite a long way into the future and the big power of humans is the Radch Empire, which is spelt R-A-D-C-H, and that's why it's hard for me to say. The Radch Empire use spaceships to kind of travel about and exert their rule on places, and those spaceships are powered by AI, which use ancillaries, which basically means the AI is in the minds of a bunch of they're people, but they are just ancillaries of the AI. They aren't humans in their own right. And in book one, we meet Breck, who was at one point a giant spaceship AI and has now been kind of reduced down to just one ancillary who is walking about and concealing the fact that they are an ancillary because that would be dangerous. And then throughout the books in the series, Breck gets into adventures and messes and complicated scenarios. That is the first three books in the series: Ancillary Justice, Ancillary Mercy, and Ancillary Sword. Mercy and Sword might be the other way around. There are then two spin-off series which follow the less human characters, I suppose. So we have Provenance and we have Translation State. Those are both spin-off books. I personally think you probably want to read the original trilogy first, but you don't have to. One of the things that is most interesting, and probably what you will clock early on reading these books, is that Ann Leckie does a really good job of thinking about future concepts of things like gender. So in the Radch world, they only ever refer to people as she. There isn't really a concept of gender, but various parts of the Radch world feel slightly differently on this. And it's something you see throughout the books, is this use of everyone having a cultural understanding of something and therefore someone feeling differently being weird is just a really powerful tool to set who is an outsider in every situation. Throughout the series, I think that's really fascinating. It's one of my favourite things that big space opera can do, is explore different civilizations and different cultural norms and social norms throughout a world and throughout a universe in this instance. One of the things I think I appreciated most about that is how it develops as the books go on. So in book one, it's a fairly cut and dry, like, this is what this is. And by the time you get to something like Translation State, there's a much more nuanced understanding of it. The books are not about gender. They aren't books exploring that as a theme, broadly speaking. They are much more about personhood and identity in that sense. But I think it's a really cool tool that's used in order to explore that theme. I had read Ancillary Justice before for a Space Sirens book club, and I honestly didn't retain pretty much any of it, and I remembered it being really complicated and difficult. On a reread by audiobook, felt very differently, and also had a similar experience to how I felt about Broken Earth, which is where I actually understood the plot of each book as its own little space opera of its own, much more than when I had read just book one on its own. I felt like I had a better understanding of what the books were trying to do, and that they weren't trying necessarily to be deep and meaningful and thought-provoking, which I think I used to think all sci-fi was. But instead, there is a lot of just good plot going on in this, very similar to something like the Texiclan duology, where there are big thought-provoking moments and it's definitely trying to get at a theme, but it's also just a good story in its own right. So yes, it does manage that space opera thing of having big plot threads and smaller little hooks to grab you and draw you in. I think particularly in the spin-off books, actually, that works really well. But the original trilogy does also still work as a trilogy where you learn more and build on various things. I mentioned Ann Leckie's use of narration and of time skips. If you like the telling a story in the present and in the past, book one will work for you. If you want that throughout the whole series, I'm sorry, it doesn't happen as much. But if you are liking that time skip kind of energy of let me go back in the past, show you something that will then inform how something is happening in the present, that is a book for you. I personally found that on my first read of Ancillary Justice, that was very confusing. And I think that's probably my biggest downside of the books as a whole, is that if you aren't prepared for them, they are a little bit confusing. There's this stuff going on with gender, which makes pronoun usage a bit confusing. There's a lot to grasp in terms of what an ancillary is. And I think my recommendation is to just let it take you and figure everything out as you go, or ask a friend who's read them as well if they have a better understanding of stuff that you don't get, is what I did. I don't think I could sit and explain to you in detail everything that happened in these books. I still found them a little bit confusing, but I enjoyed them much more because I just accepted that I was going to be confused. I know I say this all the time this year, but I'd also really recommend them by audiobook if you haven't read them that way, because I think it works much better. And the audiobook narrator is great. I think this is a series that I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everybody. It's not something that will work for everyone, and I find that with a lot of science fiction, partly because my personal enjoyment of science fiction is very varied, and it very much depends on my mood and usually on the format. I don't know that this is one that everybody would enjoy. However, I will say I think people think it is much more complicated than it is, because you have to get past a lot of the cultural stuff that has to just get explained to you. Similar to how I felt about The Principle of Moments by Esme Jamie Pearson, which is a recent space opera. There's a lot of setup for book one to have to do to create essentially a whole universe. We have moved in time, we have moved in space, we've moved cultural norms, social norms, all of this stuff. Once you get past that bit of world building, there is just a really enjoyable space opera in this. It takes a little bit of time to get there. I mentioned a bunch of things that you could compare this to. The other thing I thought I'd throw out there is Becky Chambers does a really great exploration of AI and personhood in the second book in her series, which is called A Closed and Common Orbit. Am I making that up? Becky Chambers is much cozier than this. This is not particularly cozy, but I thought it was worth mentioning. In terms of science fiction, what else have I read that I've enjoyed that's personhoody? Maybe the Adrian Tchaikovsky Children of Time series, though that's much more to do with animals rather than robots. As you know, I'm not a huge sci-fi reader. I'm very much branching out this year and sort of vaguely, generally trying to read more science fiction, but I don't read tons of it. So if you've got recommendations, let me know. And if you haven't read The Raven Tower by Ann Leckie, that's a great time as well. That's fantasy, it's very weird, it's a great time. Should you read this? I would say yes, but with some question marks after it. Like, yes? I would say if you like a space opera, go for it. Or if you're going in knowing that the first chunk of the first book might be a bit tricky, getting all the way to Translation State was my favourite. It is such a good book. It's really wonderful. It's sort of like an amalgamation of all the stuff I enjoy, and it was worth getting to, is what I'll say. Have you read these? Have you read anything else by Ann Leckie that you would recommend? Or indeed any sci-fi generally that you think is a good time? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also come hang out on Discord, where we have chill chats about books. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to all the ghosts who haunt me over on Patreon. They support the channel and in return get early access to videos, bonus content, live streams, and more. If you'd like to join their number, that's linked below as well. Thank you so much to you for watching. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one. There's gonna be some bloopers now. I had read Ancillary Justice before for a space opera? No. And the audio Nook Berator. Should you read it? I say yes, but with like a few question marks. Why did I suddenly have a weird accent? Should you read this? I would say yes, but with some question marks. Why can't I talk today?